Kuzuzongpo, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 4th International Conference on Vajrayana Buddhism. My name is Sangye Choiphel, and as part of the conference, we are talking to some of our guest speakers. And today here with me is Dr. Ian Baker, anthropologist as well as historian, and he has authored several books on Buddhism. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
Definitely. It's very good to have you here. Now, it's very interesting, Dr. Ian Baker. You were involved in the Vajrayana conference from the very get-go. Please give us a brief background on that.
Yeah, very happily. So starting from about 2004, well, particularly during 2014, 2015, I was lead curator for an exhibition in London called Tantric. It was called basically Body, Mind, and Meditation in Tantric Buddhism. And in that exhibition was featuring wall paintings from the 17th century that illustrated a treasure text of Terten Pema Lingpa, the great treasure revealer from Bhutan. So those were paintings that had been done in the private meditation chapel of the 6th Dalai Lama, but all of the illustrations were based upon texts that had been revealed by the Bhutanese treasure revealer, Pema Lingpa. So during that time, when I was trying to think how we should best present those extraordinary murals, which we made life-size reproductions of, I wanted to have objects in the exhibition that would reflect the legacy of Pema Lingpa, of the Vajrayana tradition generally, and Tantric Buddhism generally. But very specifically, I wanted to have a statue made of Pema Lingpa, because, of course, all these paintings were based upon his work. And so, on that basis, I was in consultation with Dasho Karma Ura, who had the extraordinary artistic and aesthetic eye to be able to identify traditional images of Pema Lingpa that we could photograph and then have those made by one of the foremost statue makers here in Bhutan. So those were made here and overseen by him. We had because they were all Dzogchen murals, so we had a beautiful Kunduzangpo made for the exhibition, but particularly a very beautiful Pema Lingpa statue. And then also Dasho Karma was very involved with some of the other objects that I wanted to feature in that exhibition. That included these kind of meditation sticks, the kind of moon sticks that could be held up. He made a few beautiful ones like that. And I also wanted to reproduce the original text from which these murals had been, what was the text by which the artists who made these murals were referring to. So that original text is in Gangte Monastery in Bhutan. But we weren't able, to borrow that for the exhibition. So Dasho Kamura very, amazingly made this beautiful reproduction of it where we were able to recreate with the illustrations of the yogic movements and display those at the exhibition. Because one of the things that was really the highlight of these paintings from Lhasa, but illustrating Pema Lingpa's teachings, were these chokor, the magical movements, the yogic movements that in this conference Kala Rinpoche has demonstrated, and which have, as we know, historically been kept very secret.
The Niguma Yoga.
The Niguma Yoga. Yes. So here this was actually the Peling, the Pema Lingpa Yoga, Pema Lingpa magical movement series, just like this is the Niguma, we could say, because chokor roughly translated as kind of magical movements, but it's a yoga form, a physical yoga form. So that's where Dasho Karma Nora, I was coming regularly then to Bhutan, overseeing the production of these objects, getting them shipped to London. And in that period, Dasho and I had conversation about the state of Vajrayana Buddhism in the world and in Bhutan, and how to represent Vajrayana Buddhism internationally, and in this case at a major exhibition in London. Sure. And so in that, because we were also making a film about that. So in that context, we thought, wow, how interesting it would be to have a dedicated conference in Bhutan on the tradition and innovation within Vajrayana Buddhism. So in other words, where did it come from, what is it now, and where is it going? Sure. So this idea, because it's almost a state religion in Bhutan, but what Dasho had said is so important to get outside perspectives. We have many outside scholars working on Vajrayana Buddhism, but for them to come and be able to share their ideas in the Bhutanese community and interested would be something very valuable contribution to the Vajrayana community here in Bhutan. And in that context, it was very, very interesting because, one of the things we fled, this is not an ordinary conference, like it would be an academic conference in London or Paris, whatever. It was really about outside people researching these areas, not just coming to share their innermost research, but to share the ideas that they developed over their careers, with the larger Bhutanese community. So we've always felt this has had a different kind of flavor, a different quality, and that's so reflected in the beautiful cultural events that have been produced in each of the conferences, and I think mostly in the way that presenters are recognizing that they're not speaking just to a closed academic circle, they're presenting their work to a larger audience of really scholar practitioners, the majority of whom end up being Bhutanese. So this is something really special.
And we see that, especially here in the fourth conference, international conference on Vajrayana, we have more than 80 foreigners speaking as guest speakers, and it's amazing. How has this conference evolved from the very first conference till now, as the fourth rendition of it?
Yeah. So the first conference I was very involved with in the sense of kind of the external coordinator, and I was recommending and contacting many colleagues in academia who would give the opening keynote speeches, like Dr. Jeffrey Samuel gave a wonderful talk on Vajrayana, where did it come from, and where is it going? That was the opening speech, and there were, of course, wonderful speeches from Dasho Karmora himself and from others within the Bhutan community. But on that case, I contacted many, many scholars, told them what was happening, and I, in a way that's really a breach of academic protocol, requesting them to give a talk on a very specific subject.
Sure.
So from within Bhutan, another colleague, Dr. Kingawangmo, who was the archaeologist who studied at Cambridge, same time I was at Oxford. And I had asked her, she had done fascinating research on the Khandro Daik, the secret codes of the Dakinis. So she gave a wonderful talk on that. So in this case, rather than requesting someone to submit an abstract, we made requesting. We knew how Dasha and I had discussed what are the subjects we want to have covered, and who are the best people to cover those subjects. So that was a very interesting approach that we took that was a bit different from how generally conferences are done. So the first conference was general in the sense of tradition and innovation. So
that was the theme?
That was the theme,
Okay.
Tradition and Innovation. It was called, I think, a mandala of 21st century perspectives. That was the subtitle of that first conference. So the proceedings from that are also titled that, a mandala of 21st century perspectives from within, inside, and outside the tradition. Then the second conference, which happened only, that was 2016.
That's right.
And then the next one was 2018 only. It was going to be every 2 years. So the next one, which we did, was more general, but there was such an incredible response. And so on that occasion, I was requested to give like a 20-minute presentation to the Prime Minister at that time, which was a synopsis of the entire conference, to put it into kind of what were the major themes covered, and to illustrate that also. So at that time, it was very exciting for all of us, because I think Prime Minister was very enthusiastic. He said, no, we should do this every year, not every 2 years. And he also had proposed at that time that we actually create a Vajrayana Institute in Bhutan, and that Bhutan take a leading role in the way Vajrayana was presented to the world. And these conferences were going to be really the platform by which that could happen on an annual basis. So 2019 was very exciting, and that was also in this building. Zinchengar was more or less completed, so we were the first time we were able to host it here. And on that occasion, the theme was method and techniques in Vajrayana Buddhism. And the reason for that is, obviously, Vajrayana Buddhism or Tantric Buddhism is part of the larger, the great Mahayana tradition. But often, what's emphasized is that the view is Mahayana, but the practice is the skillful means of the Tantric path, meaning many different yogic techniques, some of which are shared with even Shaiva Buddhism, Hinduism. So method and techniques was going to be the emphasis, taplam, as it's called, of course, in the Dzongkha or Tibetan tradition. How are the methods used so why you can reach enlightenment in one lifetime, rather than waiting for eons and eons and lifetime after lifetime? This is of course what Vajrayana is famous for, as being the quick path, the direct path. And of course, that's what gives rise to all of its extraordinary iconography and rich philosophy and techniques. So that was the last conference in 2019, Method and Techniques.
This year?
And then this year was originally Vajrayana Buddhism and Modernity. So the Modernity Buddhism, what it was called, but really we were speaking at first about the modernity of Vajrayana Buddhism. So the backstory of that is, what is the relevance of this very ancient tradition going back hundreds of years? How is it relevant in today's contemporary culture? So that was what we wanted to emphasize in this particular fourth annual Vajrayana conference. So on that basis, I also, as before, recommended who I thought would be great speakers and great presenters, and I went, particularly made a journey to meet with Kala Rinpoche because I was so impressed by his ability to bridge between the ancient culture and contemporary culture, and particularly in his dedication to presenting the physical practices for mental and physical well-being from the Niguma Yoga tradition, which he's presented here and which are extraordinary. And I think he also is a voice that's able to reach across cultures and across generations. And other people who I had been teaching with Dolpo Tuku Rinpoche from Nepal, but we were doing a course together teaching in Norway this last summer. So I also requested that he come and present his incredible innovation in being able to work with the traditional Salung Trulkor practices, but modifying them for contemporary audience, including his own monks and as well as his own Western students. So this is what I found very exciting in the opening session of this year's conference, mind-body practices. How have they evolved? How are we actually able, when we talk about technology evolving, we talk about outer technology, but these are the inner technology, inner methods and techniques of Vajrayana Buddhism. Why shouldn't they also evolve? And that's what I found so exciting about Kala Rinpoche's work and then Dolpo Tuku's work, and I think a lot of the other speakers in that first panel were addressing that subject.
Right. We do have a lot of other speakers who are talking about Buddhism and metaverse, Buddhism and simulation, especially in terms of technology and this blockchain technology that's happening around these days. Fascinating, definitely fascinating. Now, Doctor, you are one of the speakers, and you have already spoken. Your presentation is on the realms, especially zhing, nekor, and beyu. Please talk a little bit about your presentation.
Okay. I'll give you a little bit of background to why I spoke on that subject this time in the context since I've been involved with all of the conferences. So in the very first conference, what I presented on were the physical yogic practices that Pema Lingpa had revealed in the 15th century and which were the subject of the exhibition that I had just done in London. Then in the second conference, I gave a talk on the history of Vajrayana Buddhism in the West. And then on the third conference, I gave a talk on the evolution of the Vajra body. So in other words, the subtle body, the inner body, which is the basis for all Tantric Buddhist practice. And at that time, I was working on a major book, which seems to be in the bookstores in Thimphu, which I'm happy to see, called Tibetan Yoga Principles and Practices, which is looking at the physical practices which are used from ancient time in the Tantric Buddhist tradition, and particularly in the context of the 6 yogas of Naropa, or the 6 yogas of Niguma, the 6 yoga tradition generally, which are the completion stage practices of the Vajrayana path. So that book had been finished, and I'd already given a talk on, you could say, which is why I was the moderator for Kala Rinpoche, because I had the background in the physical yogas of the Tantric Buddhist tradition. But what I really wanted to talk about on this occasion, on the modernity of Vajrayana Buddhism, how is it relevant in today's world? We face such extraordinary environmental challenges across the planet. And I became very interested in what were all the sites of practice of Vajrayana Buddhism generally. The Buddha left his palace, went off into the forest, enlightened under trees. His own enlightenment experience under a Bodhi tree was stimulated by his memory of sitting under a rose apple tree, remembering nature and humanity in primal harmony. So this idea, I find, is reflected in, then you see later in the Mahayana tradition, we have the tradition of the Shinkam, these kind of Buddha realms, these paradises, which, through meditation or even after death, through prayer and aspiration, you can be reborn in a paradisical world. But what I find fascinating about Vajrayana Buddhism, rather than kind of escaping this world, it's about how do we actually work within this dimension, accepting this world and working skillfully to transform that which needs to be transformed, accepting that which needs to be accepted, and rejecting which needs to be rejected. So I wanted to talk on how the tradition of, you could say, the Shinkam, the Buddha paradises where you could meditate yourself into, could actually be reflected on this planet itself, on the earth. And that was the tradition of the Beyu, the hidden lands. Like in Bhutan, you've got Kembajong, you've got Chumpune, you've got even Pemaling in the east. There's even some Beyu, they say, up in the upper Tang Valley in Bumtang. So this idea of places on the earth where the elements are so pure and so resonant, and for someone who comes into, with the right view, let's just say, or what we would call in local tradition, danang, the pure vision, where you actually see the purity of that, and you come into resonance with that environment. And that's why these places like Bayu, like Pema Kö, where I know a lot of Bhutanese now are going to the Indian side of Pema Kö, and where I made 10 journeys into Pema Kö and wrote a book about that called The Heart of the World, a journey to that's lost paradise, which is also in the bookstores here. So I became very interested. How can this idea of Bayu, which is like a Shinkan, but what they call Sacha Shinkan, it's an earthly paradise essentially. How is it that those places not only can awaken us to our incredible responsibility we're part of nature, we are nature, it's not our relationship to it. It's something we're deeply responsible for. And I was very interested in how that tradition can evolve in terms of a kind of commitment, not just to, you could say, the personal or the enlightenment of all beings, which is of course the standard prayer in Mahayana and Vajrayana, but the enlightenment of the earth, and to take into our dedication to work for the welfare and of all of nature, which we are of course an integral part of. So that's what I wanted to speak about on this conference, given the fact that we are kind of, even coming out of COVID, and even COVID itself, a reflection of the imbalance of humanity and nature. So the talk was really about reviewing my explorations of Pema Kö, this extraordinary hidden land of Guru Rinpoche, Guru Padmasambhava, that is held by tradition to be a reflection of where he came from, Uddiyana, Urgyen. Urgyen Rinpoche came from Uddiyana, this kind of lost mythical world like Shambhala. But Pema Kö was seen to be a place that people could visit that had the qualities of Uddiyana. It also had the qualities of Shambhala, it's said. It also has the qualities of the Buddha fields of Sukhavati or Dewachin. So I found it fascinating that there was a place on earth that was actually reflecting those qualities, and I became interested in how people engaged with those landscapes, how they affected them, and how those places could be preserved, given their extraordinary natural qualities.
Well, that's very fascinating. But one question comes to my mind now. It might not be relevant, but especially when we talk about realms or places, and especially in the context of modernity and technology. Now, metaverse, virtual reality, simulation. How does that tie into what you're doing? Because I feel that it's very relevant, especially in the modern context with advancing technologies.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, one of the talks, I don't remember which one, talking about how the importance of the metaverse. Places that people can't go, people even can't spend the time to meditate to be able to reach these paradisical dimensions. Which are realms, but are they realms of the mind? Are they realms of the earth? Are they some kind of in-between reality? And I think what interests me about the actual places in nature, you could say, is that, of course, what virtual reality offers an incredible opportunities now to engage with human possibility in a way we've never done before. But there's also the danger in doing so that we kind of disconnect from, the actual embodied existence on the earth, and think, everything can be solved, through transhumanism and which means really transcending not only our humanity but also the earth itself. And so I'm interested in the other side, which is like Chumpukne. Like, for example, there were some of the attendees of the conference and other speakers who, the day before the conference began, we made the trip up to Chumpukne to see this extraordinary, they call it Sarinipa. It's a second sari, which is also like a very, very sacred place in the Tantric Buddhist tradition, meaning it's an earthly embodiment of Chakrasamvara, and how one can actually enter and experience qualities that are just not ordinary by going to a sacred place here in Bhutan, which is at the same time can reach and come in and out in a day, and extraordinary beauty, and to understand the power of in Bhutan, which is so unique, unlike other countries in the Himalayas where the nature has been preserved to the degree that it has. And even like Kembajong, now sort of part of, a national park, but not a place that is perfect, that it's not off access to humans, because there are a lot of other species whose welfare is at least as important as the human dimension.
Definitely. Next question. Where do we see this conference going perhaps in the next 2 years now? What's the future of the 5th International Conference? How do you see that?
Well, I think that's very exciting. I think we'll see after the end of this conference whether it's envisioned to do it again a year later or 2 years later. I think a lot of those things were coming out of COVID. Bhutan just opened to tourism 3 days before the conference, a week before the conference began. So a lot of things are, and I'm sure there'll have to be an assessment by the Center for Bhutan and GNH Studies to see how this could be framed. But the things that excite me from what I've witnessed from the fourth Vajrayana conference is the deep participation of the local Bhutanese, and also in that context that it's no longer just speakers standing up in front of a podium and giving a 20-minute talk and then sitting back down the next one. This was very participatory, particularly we had Kala Rinpoche and Dopo Tukur Rinpoche giving essentially what were workshops on their work, and that allowed people, not only in the sessions that were arranged for them after dinner, but even with Dopo Tukur's talk, and also a couple other speakers introducing practices that people could introduce into their daily lives that would bring about that state of fundamental well-being, which of course is the foundation for any meaningful spiritual cultivation. So my hope would be that the next conferences would be more, and also that emphasis on experiential training that can be given outside of formal, what can teachers share that doesn't have to be shared in a traditional shedra, or a monastic training. So I think that's very exciting. The other thing that I really saw that came up a lot in this conference more than any other was that we really have almost two Vajrayanas. We have the monastic Vajrayana, and we have the Vajrayana for the lay people who have not taken monastic vows. And if we look at the history of Vajrayana, of course that's fascinating, because we also see that the original Buddhist tantras, the Guhya Samaja Tantra, Hevajra Tantra, Chakra Samvara, Kala Chakra, were in many ways the transmission that went from India to Tibet was with non-monastics. Like, for example, with Kagyu tradition, it was, it went from Naropa after he left the monastery to debatably whether it left Nalanda or not, but it went to Marpa, then it went to Milarepa, then it went to Rechungpa, then it went to Gampopo, who had been a monk, and then that was a whole new shift in what happened with Kagyu tradition after a very yogic tradition was reintegrated with a very conservative monastic tradition of the Kadampas, and then we had all the various lineages following that. But we also had the Shangpa Kagyu, which was fascinating, because that was again a lay yogi, Kyumpa Naljor, who traveled to Kashmir because he wanted to receive teachings from the great yogini masters of Niguma Mahasiddhas, female Mahasiddhas, Sukhasiddhi and Niguma. So that's a fascinating idea that I think, sometimes so many people have the idea of more, of what is Tibetan Buddhism, and you think of monasteries, but when you look at the early roots of it, it was really a fascinating culture of male and female practitioners outside of institutional religion, working with great teachers, both male and female, and developing method and techniques that they could introduce in their lives to bring out the full potential of their human condition. So that to me is something will be exciting to look at, drawing. A lot of the talks, even Kentram and others, looking, what is Vajrayana Buddhism in terms of what are the actual vows? How do those differ from Vinaya vows, for example? How does it work? So this, I think, we're getting to a point where things that were completely taboo a few years ago, like imagine, Kala Rinpoche showing Tsalung Trulkor publicly and giving very clear reasons for why that should not be kept secret. We're moving into a new dimension where old taboos are being removed, and therefore we can look more clearly at Vajrayana as a whole and kind of look at as it was with Guru Rinpoche. In the time of Samye Monastery at the 8th century, he established two sanghas. There was the red sangha to follow the sutras, and there was the white sangha to follow the tantras. They were actually parallel, and they were meant to be held equally, but they weren't mixing in the same way, because what was appropriate for the red sangha was not appropriate for the white sangha. This was very interesting. And Atisha, of course, when he came 10th century to Western Tibet, also recognized that there were kind of two tracks. And this, I think, needs more discerning, because sometimes if we mix these things too much, then there can be this kind of dissonance or confusion about, what? And I think particularly in the West, it's because there we don't have what you have in Bhutan, which is a dynastic support for Tantric Buddhism, which was always supported by royal dynasties, Pala dynasty, India, Mala, the dynasty, all of the Chavi dynasty, Nepal, there was always royal support for the cultural expansion of the Vajrayana Buddhism. But you look in Europe and America, there's nothing even remotely like that. So that means it's really a tradition that has to be internalized, and I think that's where the yogic tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism is, in a sense, a more effective model in the West, because I think generally most people who are drawn to Vajrayana in the West they're not oriented towards, if they're oriented towards becoming a monk, they tend to seek out the Theravada orders, which are also available in the West. But Vajrayana tends to appeal to those who are interested in bringing out their full potential of humanity and working creatively and constructively in the world, not in a conventional way of renunciation that we have in early Buddhism, but renouncing all of the egotistical, distractive, useless ways that we can get preoccupied, and really channeling with wisdom and compassion all your own personal, human, individual talents and capacities. And that's what I see so beautifully expressed in, as you could say, at the pinnacle of the Center for Bhutan Studies with Dasha Kamarura, who's always been a role model for me, and he's like a Renaissance man that we look at in the West in terms of his, his literature and the arts and his intellectual pursuits and his political engagement. So to me, this is extremely really what the Vajrayana tradition was about. When you look at the great siddhas, they were engaged with the world. They were not. They might go for periods of time up to a cave. That was, of course, part of it. But then coming back, as Shakyamuni Buddha himself did, into the human realm in order to share what they had learned in solitude.
Well, that's wonderful. Truly said, Dashkarmura is a cultural treasure here in Bhutan, as well as it's kind of fascinating how you said Vajrayana. It's you could definitely tell where it's leading to now, where it's going to. Maybe a hint of it, perhaps, in terms of breaking taboos or foregoing taboos. And it's only going to be exciting to see what's going to happen next, and it's a beautiful thing. Doctor, any last words before we, due to the lack of time?
To follow up on just what you said, this idea of breaking taboos, of course, is what really Vajrayana was in the very beginning. It was breaking the taboos of early Buddhism. It was transgressive, it was radical, it was taking the very heart of the Buddhist commitment to wisdom and compassion, but finding a way in which that could be expressed in the world rather than by retreating from the world. And I think that's really exciting. I think the conferences on Vajrayana Buddhism are expressing exactly that spirit and the breaking of taboos. Taboos really are actually just the rigidities of our mind. And we also see that everything evolves. So if we are engaged with a 2,500-year-old tradition of Buddhism, this also has to evolve. So we want the treasure of what we bring from the past through its texts, through its traditions, but when is it appropriate to modify? How do we do that? And to be very skillful in making sure that we're still on track, rather than kind of going into some deviation, rather than an evolution. So in my sense, it's extremely exciting. There's no place in the world that could host this kind of conference in the same way that Bhutan can, because this is really wonderful. And I think what this does is starts to reach a younger generation. It reaches people outside of the monastic community who say, oh, Vajrayana is for us also. So this to me is the most exciting thing that I've witnessed in all of the conferences so far.
Definitely. Vajrayana Buddhism is very inclusive, and it is very exciting. This has been a talk with Dr. Ian Baker. My name is Sangye Choiphel, and goodbye.